All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to iWizard. So today we're going to be talking about the third and fourth books of Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun. And I imagine that we'll also talk about the series as a whole, since I am now finished with The Book of the New Sun. It's an accomplishment I never thought I would really achieve. I still need to read Earth of the New Sun. Is there anything else I'm missing, Christopher, like short stories, novellas, anything else that...
There are actually a couple short stories. The Map, the Cat, and then there are a couple that are sort of less explicitly about the world, but are stories that are in the world. I can't remember all the titles, but The Map and the Cat are kind of the two short stories that you kind of should read.
The Map is one story and The Cat is another?
Yeah, two separate ones, The Map and the Cat. Yeah.
Okay. All right, so then we'll get into that. But before we do, I would like to introduce my special guest, whom I've already kind of introduced. His forbearance knows not walls nor seas. His perspiration is the gold of his subjects. His pores outshine the stars themselves. May his spirit live in 1,000 successors. In fact, he is 1,001. Viceroy of the New Sun, his radiance, Christopher Ruocchio. Welcome.
Thanks for having me back, man.
Sure, dude. All right, so just to kick us off here, I wanted to say that Christopher and I have already talked about Shadow and Claw, the first two books of the New Sun. You can check out our discussion on that if you haven't done so already. But again, today we're here to talk about Sword and Citadel, and then a bit of the overarching stuff. And when I say this is what we did last time we talked, this is Shadow and Claw, I'm just going by these editions here. And this is Sword and Citadel. I left it out and my cat destroyed it. This was a perfect mint condition book until that little bastard, went crazy on this. So
an agent of Erebus. No.
Yeah.
Truly.
Really a shame. Why don't we start with this, Christopher? I find this question interesting and maybe one that you haven't had to, that you haven't fielded before. What do you think inspired Gene Wolfe to write this story? Apparently, one of Wolfe's original ideas was to write a book about a young man going to war. You know more about Gene Wolfe than I do, so you can tell me. What are generally his influences? Was he, where was he getting a lot of this stuff? I know he was able to, he was drawing on, Jack Vance and the Bible, T.S. Eliot. I personally, as a fan of both Dickens and Proust, he was drawing on those figures as well, remembrance of things past. And so those are, I guess, very specific literary inspirations, but what tradition is Wolfe working in? Just getting a handle on him as an author. Where is he getting these ideas, and what kind of tradition is he operating in?
Yeah, well, those are all there's a lot there, right? So the first thing, as far as the initial kernel, my understanding is, and I'm not a biographer of Wolfe's by any means, but my understanding is that the kernel of the story was that he wanted to write about a young man going to war, which was part of his own experience, right? Wolfe was a Korean War vet. One of, at the time, a very small number of science fiction writers who'd actually seen action, right? David Drake was one. There are a couple others, but I know that Wolfe and Drake both had a strong, relationship based on the fact that they were both vets. Drake was in Vietnam, and so there's actually something that Wolfe wrote about in a David Drake anthology that I helped publish when I worked at Bain Books. He wrote a little bit of an essay about the kinship he felt with Dave on account of their shared military experience. And so I think it is not precisely a biographical novel, right? But in sort of a sideways kind of way, it's drawing from a lot of his own personal experiences. When you get into the actual war sections in Citadel, right? They really, feel like, these are the reflections of a guy who was actually there. right? He talks about the sort of thing that a writer like me might leave out, right? Like the fact that a lot of war is just waiting around in boredom, punctuated by 10 seconds of absolute terror, right? It has that feel to it. And so I think just capturing that sort of that ethos, right, is the like romance of going to war clashes with the reality, was sort of the seed of the original project. Now, I have never read the just the novella version that this grew out of, and I know it's called The Feast of Holy Catherine, and so this is probably a gap in my education, but I think it just deals with the initiation stuff at the beginning, right? Because at the beginning of Shadow of the Torturer, there are all of these moments where Severian is sort of stating or asking, is this the point at which I've become a man, right? And he talks about the soldiers receiving a coin and that being the symbol of their transformation. To borrow, is that a Jung novel, Symbols and Transformations? Not novel.
It might be Man and His Symbols.
Yeah,
I think that's another one.
But it's about those symbols of transformation, right? The coin, his habit as a guildsman, the sword itself. And so it's really a story about those changes, right? And about growing up, and about, sort of generational renewal as sort of symbolized through the whole cosmic cycle, right? Because that's the thing, right? Is that Wolfe is, he's a Catholic, right? To speak about the traditions he's coming out of, this is a big part of it. And this sort of sense, right, that there is a sort of a pattern that is carried out on the cosmic scale that is repeated, to borrow a Ptolemaic term, in epicycles, right, in the lives of each of us individually, right? We're all supposed to imitate the life of Christ, right? The life of God. And he says Severian isn't Christ precisely, but he's a Christian figure, and he's a Christian figure in this sense, right? He is imitating, the action of God, right, in a very literal way in the text, right, by bringing about a new creation on earth, right? And so that's part of that tradition, and that all ties back into this sort of central theme about growing up and about going to war. So it's playing, on this very personal human level, all the way up to the cosmic at the same time. And that's really, I think, what the story is about. As far as the other like seed where he got the idea from, he's pretty on the nose about it. It was reading Jack Vance, right? It was reading Dying Earth. He wanted to do his own take on it, and he brought in a lot of his own more sort of literary bent, right? Not that Vance isn't necessarily literary, right? He's certainly, kind of in the middle of the spectrum if you had to really stack up science fiction writers. But, I'm not trying to denigrate Vance in any way. Vance is a genius.
No,
but
pulpy meets literary, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, he's sort of right down the middle in a way that like Wolfe's like way out on the literary end, and someone like maybe Fritz Leiber is sort of towards the pulpier end of the spectrum.
I wonder where Christopher Ruocchio is. Where would you say he straddles that line?
I want to be kind of in the middle personally. I might skew a little towards the literary. But I kind of want to be in the middle. But yeah, so Vance was really the thing. And I don't know what about the Dying Earth sort of subgenre spoke to Wolfe precisely and said, this is the thing that I'm going to do next, right? This is going to be my magnum opus. I don't even know if he knew this was going to be the one thing that like people really, pinned to his name, right? When he set out, because I mean, who does, right? Could have been the Wizard Knight for all he knew, right? Maybe. Although the fact that he went back and did 2 more series in this, maybe that in this universe, maybe that some indication they had an idea. In any case, yeah. So as far as the traditions, right, talked about the religion, but there's also in terms of style, he's a postmodernist, right? Right, which is usually for me a 4-letter word, right? Because like all the postmodern philosophers are just evil, demonic, jerks. But that's another conversation.
Well, another reason it's hard, Christopher, is that I agree with you, and I think you're right about that. And I share your skepticism of postmodernists who themselves have skepticism for everything. But what I would say is, I do sometimes, and you'll probably agree with this, I sometimes think it's hard to draw the line precisely, because you'll have people who call, Samuel Beckett and James Joyce modernists, and you'll call then later novelists and later critics and theorists postmodernists. And so I guess I would say that he kind of straddles a line between modernism and postmodernism. But in sci-fi is usually it's known for being kind of straight to the point and clear, and you're going to be able to understand these ideas and you're going to be able to get through it. And it's got its origins in, well, Victorian sci-fi and then the pulps. So I'm thinking that when you read someone like Wolfe, you're tempted to say it's super postmodern. And it does have those qualities, right? The non-linearity and the playing with time and how fragmented it is, and all of the little nuances and the way that it doesn't hold your hand and the way that it's kind of disjointed and all of that. But at the same time, yeah, I don't know. It also felt a little bit like reading one of those early 20th century modernist novels in some ways as well. Someone like James Joyce.
Absolutely. Right. And because you're right, it's really impossible to draw hard lines between genres. This is one of my bugbears, right? And even separating science fiction and fantasy is, to my mind, pointless unless you're trying to sell a book to somebody, right? The only reason to explain, how is this cyberpunk? Is this gothic horror? Is it, whatever, right? Cosmic horror, right? And where those lines are is if you're trying to sell the book to somebody. Really, every book, because what people in science fiction mean by genre, right? And we talked about this, I think, on my channel, is a collection of like tropes and things, right? Almost nobody in science fiction fantasy spaces think about style very much. They're just like, I liked that sentence. That sentence was nice, right? Which is like totally fine, but they're not thinking about what tradition of, literary style is this book in. But he is a postmodernist, right? In at least the fact that we all are. Right. And this is what I think is so great about Wolfe, because ethically he has nothing in common with, Derrida, Foucault, or even
Catholicism doesn't mix well with postmodernism in a lot of ways.
Right. Or anyway, really. Right. But he recognizes that like he is writing post-modernity, right, in any case, right? The Somme has already happened, right? World War I is over, World War II is over, right? Like it's the future, deal with it. And so he's writing in the sort of literary sort of it style of this period, right? But with a sort of ethical core that is much older than that, and sort of transcends time in a certain sense, at least so I would say, being a Catholic myself, right? And so he's able to kind of get the best of both worlds. One of the things that's so interesting about being in like Gene Wolfe fan groups on Facebook, right, is there are a lot of people who really love the books and who love Wolfe who are really hostile to Wolfe's worldview. And you see this with Tolkien too, right? And that's so interesting. And I think it's because either people aren't thinking that closely, or I think it's because people might even engage with both Tolkien and Wolfe on an aesthetic level before they think about anything. And I think in a certain sense, aesthetics are more powerful than ethics, right? And so I think that simply, right, we've been real academic for the last 10 minutes, but like simply off the back of the fact that this is a science fantasy adventure series about a former torturer, right, who becomes the emperor of the world by eating the brain of his predecessor and gaining all the memories of all of the former emperors, while also fighting a bunch of Cthulhu creatures that live in the ocean that are controlling a nation of potentially clone communists, right, to try and conquer the earth. Like, that's awesome, right? And just on the back of how cool that is, right, just purely on like a rock and roll level, right, I think people can get into this book in the same way that like Lord of the Rings is awesome because it's about a bunch of dudes trying to destroy a magical bit of jewelry, right, with the odds stacked against them. They have to cross the entire world to get there. That's cool, right? That's just cool on the face of it. You don't like think about where the author is coming from until you're like well invested in, like, oh gosh, he just like mercy killed this lady who was his prisoner and his girlfriend, right? And now she's a part of him, and what the hell is going on, right? And that's one of the things that's so great about literature, period, right? Is that because it's narrative and because it's aesthetic, it can kind of knock over basically any fence. Right, you could be like a Shinto, right, and like love Lord of the Rings, right? You don't have to be a Catholic to like it, right? You don't have to be a Catholic to like this. You don't have to be anything to like anything. Like a story is a story, and if it changes you in some way, and good stories do, right, then that's great, right? This is why like I don't do polemics, right? Like a story is so much cooler, and at minimum it's more fun. right? And so I want to reiterate, I guess, sort of upfront, we're a little bit in now, that like all the talk about Book of the New Sun is about how like dense it is and about how amazing and complicated. And that scares a lot of people. And it really, really shouldn't. Because Wolfe he's writing for smart readers, but that's because he knows you're smart, right? It's not because he thinks you have to be, right? He trusts you to like puzzle out enough for you to have a good time, but he's not trying to like be condescending, right? He's not trying to write a book that's up its own ass for the sake of doing so, right? There's just a lot there because he wants you to like get your money's worth, basically, right? And that's what separates him from, I won't name names, but like other writers, right? Who like really are writing books to be self-impressed or self-impressive. That's not the game here, right? This is just trying to be the best book that it can be. And because it's Gene Wolfe, it's a really good book, right? So that's sort of my opening statement.
Yeah, and I guess I would add to that too. I find it astonishing how confident Wolfe is as a writer. As a writer myself, I am always being very neurotic about, am I being clear? Will my reader understand what I'm saying? Will they know what I'm talking about? If I plant this seed, will they pick up on it later? So kind of, two questions there. First of all, I want to know what made Wolfe so certain that his readers were going to pick up on all this stuff or even dig deeply enough to think through what he's doing, because there are so many details and nuances buried in the text. There is so much subtext and symbolism, and there's very little hand-holding. It's one of those books, and this touches on the point you just made, that you kind of get out of it what you put into it. You can read this at a bunch of different levels, I would argue. You can be kind of a normie person that just wants like a good story, and you can pick it up and you can read it from start to finish, and you can be like, wow, that was really interesting, and I wonder what's going on there. But, in similar ways to the way in which people, I'm not comparing the two authors, trust me, the way in which people say that they enjoy Steven Erikson, I'll ask people, I'll say, how do you do that? I tried to get through Gardens of the Moon and I had no clue what was going on. And yet I didn't feel like I was getting as much out of it as I just got out of Gene Wolfe. But people will be like, oh no, man, you don't, just try not to understand it. Just go along for the ride, man. So, and I find it hard to do that. But I feel like you can enjoy Wolfe at different levels. Like you could have a high school senior read Book of the New Sun and maybe not really get so much of it. And then you could have them reread it when they're 30 and read it at a different level and kind of study it. And you could get more. It depends on how much energy you want to put into it, how many theories you kind of want to run through, how much you want to think about what he's doing. And speaking of confidence, one of the questions I have is, how the heck do you write a book that is set possibly 1 million years in the future? You would have to rethink everything through. Human beings, will they be different? Will they be more evolved? Human institutions, evolution, geology, right? The solar system, right? For goodness sakes. So it's just such a complex masterwork. And I wanted to ask you two questions. One, do you agree with me about the kind of confidence that Gene Wolfe has as an author in just pulling all of this off? And second is, do you think that something like this could get published today?
So the second one is sort of two questions. Do I think it would sell? I don't know. I think that it's a lot harder to find an audience for any writer, regardless of what you're writing now than then, right? And that's an economy of scale issue. There are just more books, right? I think there were more than 1 million books published per year for like the past 3 or 4 years now, right? Between all self-published stuff and just the general growth of the industry. Do I think it would get published? I do. I don't know where, right? But every editor that I know, right, has sort of two modes. They have a like, oh, this is commercial and it's totally gonna like make money. This is gonna work. It's gonna find an audience. And then they have a moment, and it's maybe like once every 5 years, where they'll read something and they'll be like, this is the best thing that I've read in 20 years and it needs to be published. I don't care if it loses money. We're gonna take a shot. And sometimes when they do that, they'll sign 4 books, and then they will lose money, right? And so I think that those editors exist, and I think that I think that someone would take a chance on a story like this. It might not be exactly the same story, or the same kind of writer necessarily. But I do think that there's still room for experimentation. It's not all completely corporate crowdsourced stuff. There's a lot of that, but I do think there's still some room, even in the mainstream sort of industrial industry, for writers like Gene Wolfe. I mean, he's only not been with us for a couple of years now, and he was writing right up until the end. And his editor, David Hartwell, only passed away a little bit before him as well. And so, we're only a couple of years removed from the man himself. So I really don't think that it's necessarily impossible. And towards the latter half of his career, Wolfe was writing a lot more experimental stuff anyway. Got even more out there. Like, this is towards the commercial line for him. This and Wizard Knight and maybe the Soldier books are like his like most commercial stuff. Like things like Peace, which I haven't read, or the two like library books that are kind of cyberpunky. Those are a little bit more sort of, they're like latter, like William Gibson in a way, right? They're just kind of like, what do we do with this? What box does this fit in? I don't know. It's William Gibson, print it. And those are maybe like late career books, right? So like maybe this is something that like a writer who establishes his bona fides might turn to, for a second series, a third series. I don't know. As far as the confidence thing, I mean, obviously, right? I think this is one of the like bits of writing advice that like I try to give as often as I can, but it like always fails to come to my mind the first, because I always talk about outlining. And that's that like most of the actual magic of literature isn't on the page, and it is in the author's hands at all. It's in the reader's brain, right? Because you can totally just say this guy was wearing green clothes, right? And the reader's brain is going to populate the details, right? What do the buttons look like? Are there buttons? Is there a collar? I don't know. Is it camouflage? What's the pattern? And their brain will do that sort of automatically, and they won't even notice that it's happened. I'm a big fan of Lois Bujold, right? And she's very sparse with her physical description, very sparse. She'll literally she never at any point describes like the uniforms of her military, right? She just says, undress greens, dress greens. And because of the Russian cues, you're kind of filling in Soviet Tsarist details, but she never says like the Soviets, right? She never says, Zhivago shirt, right? You just kind of do that yourself. And Gene Wolfe is doing that, but like way past just clothing details, right? He's like, someone's going to read this at some point, and at minimum tell his friend who's reading it for the first time that this guy's a robot, right? Because someone's going to miss that. And he's really, really the supreme master of that sort of leap of faith, right? And trusting the reader to do the work that he's totally like laying the foundations, but the readers are really the people who build the house, right? Because I have found in talking to my own readers that I think about stuff a lot less than they do. Which is not to say that I don't think about stuff a lot, right? Because I'm the one doing the outlining and I like pour over this for a year. But like I'll have people ask me really specific questions about stuff I've forgotten about, right? And that's because, in a sense, right? Like I'm not a death of the author guy, right? But like my work is done, right? At least with a lot of my books. And I'm working on one right now, whatever's in the future. But the ones that are done are done. And so Wolfe is perfectly willing to leave, the walls, unpainted, right? The windows open, and to let you decorate the damn place, right? And it does that in regards to certain physical details, right? Because he'll just say, he'll say destrier, and he'll mean horse, but he'll mean weird alien horse with claws. And you have to figure out the claws part, right? You have to figure out who's a robot and who isn't a robot, and are those clones? I'm not sure. But like he's left the roadmap there, and that's something that really separates, I think, a master craftsman, and I'm not claiming to be one, from like normal writers, right? Is that sort of faith, especially because like I remember when I was like just starting out, right? Like my instinct was to explain everything, right? Like people need to know exactly what this costume looks like, and like sometimes you want to flex a little physical description, that's fine, but like I want to make sure everyone knows exactly like what the tiles in this room look like and all this, and you get this sort of like complete overload. And then on the other hand, you get the white room problem, right? And learning to adjust that balance is hard in and of itself so that people can see what you're talking about. But at the same time, learning to step back and not write is often as hard as learning how to write in the first place. And it's something that I think just does take either practice or faith. And I think Wolfe has both.
Yeah, for sure. Really a master at that. So I wanted to get into these books and start by asking you here, what is your favorite of the 4 books of the New Sun? You know, I don't know if you've thought about this question before, but, you know, kind of doing another reread of this. I know you've read this several times. What would you say is your enduring favorite at this point?
It's either 2 or 3. I think it's Sword of the Lictor most days. Every now and then, like, I can make a compelling argument for Claw, and even every now and then Citadel will jump up, but really Sword of the Lictor takes the cake for me. It has all the cool stuff, right? And after having done this academic discussion, the reason I like Sword of the Lictor is because this is the one that has the, like, dragon fight, and it's got the, you know, the scary wolf that eats people and speaks in their voices. It's got, you know, the battle with two-headed Satan on a mountain. It's got giant robots. You know, it has the battle with Frankenstein's monster / Frankenstein himself in a castle with a spaceship. It introduces the aliens who might be angels, right? Or at least working for them. It's got all the just the neatest stuff in the series. And so that's why it really takes the cake for me. 2 will come into play just because I really like Jonas and I really like the play. And just because Jonas is, like, he's basically the only, like, unanimously decent human in the entire series, and he's not even a human, right? And so just having him around is kind of heartwarming. But no, Sword of the Lictor is just damn cool. And so that's my really advanced monocle wearing reason for liking Sword of the Lictor. But what about you?
Probably the first, just because I understood it best, because I'm a new reader. And it read, at least for the first half of the story, like a traditional fantasy tale. Now, I'm not saying that on a reread, I won't like another book better. I actually think that when I reread this, I might like book 3 the best. But for me, it's going to be book 1 because I'm not entirely confident that I understand it. The full thing, that is. But for me, book 3, Sword of the Lictor, is interesting because it feels like it's the most, and this is going to be like the opposite of what you just said. Everything you said is true. There's all that cool stuff in it. But in between those moments, it does feel to me like it's the most ruminative. Like it's the most almost navel-gazy. Not in a bad way. I like that stuff. I'm a philosophy major.
Right.
It's
well,
a
Severian
meditation.
spends so much of it alone, right?
What's that?
Or
say that again.
Severian spends so much of it alone.
Yes.
Right. Or nearly alone.
Yes. And not a lot of authors can pull that off. One, piece of advice that, an editor will give you is, you should not have your character alone thinking thoughts all of the time. You need to have your character interacting with people. Otherwise it gets boring. With Wolfe, it never gets boring. You can imagine putting on some shoegazer band like Cigarettes After Sex or Beach House and just listening to, if you're listening to the audio, listening or reading Wolfe just describe the mountains and the stars. There's just so much symbolism with like mountains in that book, right? And, he's laying back and staring at the stars. What other writer can do that where you're lying in the grass with Severian and he's staring at the stars and he's pondering about the cosmos and his identity and philosophical horror and time and justice, and he's and you're laying there and you're going along with Severian. For me, I'm in my bed listening to the audio and I'm like, this is amazing, this is really good. And most authors can't pull that off, and when they try, it feels forced or awkward. Or when Severian in book 3 is trying to be a father, there's just so much reflection and kind of what they call in new wave sci-fi, they call the exploration of inner space versus outer space, which is really the new wave mantra. I forget who the hell it was. Hold on, that said that. I think it was it, what's his name? Moorcock that said that.
It sounds like something he'd say, but I'm not sure.
Or it might have been Moorcock or someone else. But that's actually why I liked Sword of the Lictor, is that it was very reflective. There were all sorts of, there's like I forget if it's in that book. There's a defense of torture. Yes, it's at the beginning of that book where Severian is mounting this defense of why he does what he does and why his institution exists and how most people don't understand it. And it's very Socratic, right? And some of the things that he's teaching little Severian. So there's a lot I love in Sword as well. So I can imagine in the future that will probably be my favorite book.
Yeah, it also is my favorite of the stories within stories. As much as I like these Tale of the Student and His Son book 2, The Tale of a Boy Called Frog is part Romulus and Remus and part the Jungle Book, right? But more than that, it is also the backstory of the character Typhon, who we meet very shortly thereafter, right? Who was the last pre-autarch emperor of Earth, before, because the autarchy is sort of the monarchy that has been blessed by the Hierodules, right? These sort of angelic aliens who want to help humanity. So he was the last, sort of pagan emperor in a sense of Earth, right? In like a pre-Christian sense of the word pagan, right? Before the change, and so he's sort of set up, in this story, right, as kind of and is related back all the way to Romulus, right, in this sense, right? But he's also, there's like this Mowgli element, and the way that it's told too, right, where the planets are islands, and you've got all these like anthropomorphic animals, and it's so neat. I love when writers play with history. It's one of my favorite things to do too. There's a bit in Kingdoms of Death where Hadrian remembers the Prometheus myth, but he remembers it wrong.
Yes.
It's confused with I won't say what. Because I want to wait till someone.
I tried to guess when we talked about Kingdoms of Death, but I was apparently wrong, and so on my reread, I'm going to look for that, because I do know a lot about Greek mythology and history and that sort of thing, and so I'm ashamed that I didn't pick up on it, and I think it's because I wasn't expecting you to do that.
Yeah, but it's fun, right? Because you'll get people writing you and be like, "Oh, you don't know your Greek myth as well as you think you do, bro." And I'll be like, "I do, but like I did it on purpose, right? Because it's not an academic paper, right? Like I can be wrong on purpose, and it's cool. And you can make that point, right? It's been so long, right? And talking about building this like post-historic future, right? You have to figure out how are the pieces going to break down, right? Probably not going to go away, right? Because this is something that sort of echoed symbolically throughout the whole series, right? The miners, if you will notice, in Severian's time aren't miners; they're like scrappers, right?
They're scrappers. They just go in. Yep.
They're just going in and they're picking up old stuff, right? The beaches on the ocean are all rainbow colored because they're the glass of millennia that have been reduced to sand again, right? Like it's, which is a detail that you like will miss if you're not paying close attention.
That's that confidence I was talking about.
Yeah.
Just knowing to do that and knowing that would work and knowing how that would come off. I'm so jealous of that.
Yeah, it's amazing, right? It really is. Because I think it was when I was talking to Moid a couple days ago over on Media Death Call. One of the things that sets Wolfe above, and maybe it is the thing that sets Wolfe above all the other science fiction writers, in my opinion, is that if you cut any sentence out of this series, it will be a loss. And that's not true of most books. That's certainly not true of mine, but I don't think that's true of very many books at all. Every single sentence is deliberately placed. Every weird word is chosen with care. There's just not any dead air, right? And every little piece contributes to this sort of greater puzzle. And now there are a lot of books that are like 98% of the way there, right? 99% of the way there even. These are, I think, perfect, right? The only problem with these, right, is the same problem Tolkien describes with his own work, right? Is that it's too short, right? I would gladly read twice as much of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe that's the point, right? You should, like with romantic poets dying too soon, right? Maybe it's the dying too soon that like made them great.
Yeah.
Right. Not that John Keats wouldn't have swapped this for not having tuberculosis. And
that's very romantic of you, Christopher. I didn't expect you to be so romantic.
Well, capital R, yes. At least in certain senses. But
Because for
yeah,
me, I like Wordsworth's later stuff. I think he becomes a better, more mature poet. Of course, he spends his entire life tinkering with the prelude and that sort of thing. But no, you're right. Like Keats and Shelley and folks like that. Yeah, you could make the same argument about certain rock stars.
well, exactly. Well, so that's
Jeff
a
Buckley.
brief tangent though, right? That's one of the cool things, because I was going to say the rock star thing too. There is, on the other hand, right, because Wordsworth really has a sort of aging rock star vibe by the end of his life too, right? And what's cool about that in rock and roll, because like a lot of the old like metal guys are getting old now, right, is they're writing old man songs, right? And so
Yes.
the genre is like allowed for that space now, and that gets to be like a whole different thing, right? Because this
Right.
was like a young man's art form, and now it's an old man's thing.
Right.
But at the same time, right, they're always overshadowed in a certain way by Hendrix, right, or by Keats, by Byron, right? You know, because people have heard of Byron, they've certainly heard of the Shelleys, even if it's usually just Mary, which I think is a crime. But
Yeah. Yeah.
but they usually haven't heard of Wordsworth, right? And so sometimes overstaying one's welcome artistically is maybe to the detriment of the art. So the fact that there are only 5 volumes of this, you know, is maybe better than if there were 13. You know, I can think of certain long series that suffer for it, at least in their reputation. So, you know, but the point is it leaves me wanting, you know, twice as much as I have. And that's not true of a lot of books. And it's one of those reasons, and it is for this, among many other reasons, that I put the books so highly. But I've sort of gotten off on a tangent talking about rock
No, the
stars.
tangents are good. The tangents are welcome on this channel. I'll say one last thing about Wordsworth and we'll get back to it because I can't help it. My brain is pinging. It's a good point that you make about the aging rock stars and all of that. I like both. I like the kind of revolutionary Wordsworth who writes, "Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven." I love that Wordsworth. And then I also like the older, more conservative, more stodgy Wordsworth, who is more religious and who's looking back at his life. I think we need both things. And if you have a really like first class kind of creative mind, cognitive power, as Harold Bloom would call it, then I want to see what you're like as a young man and what you're like as an old man. Whereas I feel like a lot of rock stars today are like Mick Jagger. They're still trying to shake in the same way that they shook when they were in their early 20s. And it's like, no, Wordsworth became well adjusted and he became a family man. He got grumpier. But in part, he was grumpy about, you know, Coleridge, you know, trying to sleep with his sister. But you know, but
Just poet
anyways,
things.
total tangent, total tangent.
Yeah.
Let's zoom in to Sword of the Lictor a little bit. We have talked about it a little bit, but I want, so tell me, I think it's interesting at the start of this book that Severian has gotten pretty much what he wants. He's gotten to Thrax. He is now he's the official lictor of Thrax. He has a purpose. He has some power he's got some political power. He's got a role, which is very important. He is kind of an arm of justice in Thrax, and he's not happy. And so I'm wondering what we make of that, because he leaves Thrax. As you know, that's the plot of, you know, of Sword. He leaves Thrax, and much like Siddhartha, a lot of this
I was going to make that
story
comparison.
reminds me of Siddhartha. He leaves his home, he throws off his privilege and his position, and then he has to meet all of these people, and he has to learn from humanity, and he has to watch people die. And I think it's also important that he has to learn the nature of war and listen to people's stories and learn what it is to be a father. It's like Wolfe deliberately put him through all the things that you have to learn. In fact, I think it's even important that he was a torturer, and so he knows what that is. And it's as if Wolfe is setting up this kind of Bildungsroman, where this coming of age story, where over the course of the story, he's put through all these very specific things that you need to be a leader, that you need to be the sort of final autarch who's going to bring about who's going to deliver justice and who's going to deliver renewal, and who's going to bring about the new sun. I don't know what you think about that, but I could not help being reminded of Siddhartha and like both Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha and the story of Siddhartha Gautama Buddha.
Yeah, I think Hesse certainly was in Wolfe's mind as well, because he's another one of those writers that's sort of in this sort of camp that he is drawing from in the first place, right? But I do think we're talking about how the story is about growing up, right? And growing up is about becoming a more complete person, right? Now that means a lot of different things, right? But fundamentally, it is about, you know, finding all the parts that like fit together and make you, right? And because this sort of scales up cosmically, right? You know, that goes beyond just being one person, right? This is something I remember, and this is maybe one of the more scandalous things I'm going to say in any of these videos. There was a Tor.com like read along of Dune, and the person who was doing this said that the Kwisatz Haderach made no sense because the Kwisatz Haderach should be androgynous, right? Shouldn't be a man, right? But part of growing up, right, you know, is learning to incorporate those aspects of whichever nature you are not, right, into being a full person, right? A man needs to, you know, incorporate some aspects of the feminine in order to be a good parent, right?
Yeah.
And vice versa, right? Like a woman needs to incorporate some, you know, masculine virtues in order to be an adult, right?
Right. Well, in the traditional
but they need
sense,
to be sort of in relation to each other, right?
Right.
Like if you're a man, like you should be primarily masculine to be able to like flip the switch when, you know, the time calls for it, and vice versa.
Right.
Because if you're just masculine, then you're a brute, right? And that's not good. So Severian, in a lot of ways, resembles the Kwisatz Haderach symbolically, right? Because he undergoes this sort of, you know, kind of weird, you know, soul marriage with Thecla, right? And becomes in part, you know, feminine, right? But that's in a science fictional symbolic sense, it kind of growing up, right? Because you need to like understand, if you're a man, you need to understand like what women are like, right? Because they are different, right? Like, you know, we have a lot more in common than we have differences, but you need to like understand those differences so that you can be a good husband, right? And so he's like a complete monster to women, but he gets better, right? Severian matures, right? And by the end of the book, he's mostly pretty noble, right? Like he has an opportunity in Citadel to rape this girl, right? And he doesn't do it, right? Which is, people always talk about the Jolenta scene where he does rape her in book 2, but he doesn't do it to Daria in book 4, right? Now he kind of scares the shit out of her, right? Because he's still kind of a jerk, but he doesn't do it. And by the Severian we see in Earth, he is, you know, still kind of skeezy, right? As he's not all, you know, he's not perfect by any means, right? But he's matured along this axis, right? And so it's not just his sort of personal union spiritually with Thecla, right, through the Alzabo and all of that stuff, but it's by incorporating his predecessors, right? When he becomes autarch, right? He literally becomes a democracy of the dead, right? He becomes tradition embodied, right? He has all these other autarchs and all of their experiences, right, that he's very consciously aware of, right? Which is another way in which he resembles the Kwisatz Haderach, right? Only instead of it being his biological ancestors, it's, you know, all of the autarchs, right? And the autarchs are, because of the nature of their selection process, it's not hereditary, right? Although I think he said maybe a couple of them were, right? It's usually just the nearest person because they literally need to make sure the chain doesn't get broken, and you have to eat the previous autarch's forebrain while it's still alive. So you got to move quickly, right?
Right.
And so like his predecessor was a beekeeper, right? You know, the one that we meet, you know, the eunuch, right? Appian was a beekeeper. He was just a beekeeper, right? And one of the reasons that all of the nobility at court hate him isn't just because he's the emperor and they're the nobles and that's normal, right? In sort of a Juvenalian sense, but because he was literally their servant, right? And he got turned into their master sort of overnight. And so Severian is to incorporate all these different aspects and become Severian the Great, Severian the Lame, Severian the Mad, right? The emperor. And in order to do that, right, he has to like pick up all these little pieces on his journey. And it's not just his own experiences, right? It's those other experiences too. But his own experiences are still central because the final Severian, I kind of differ with the sort of prevailing wisdom on this. He's not just a Thecla Severian hybrid, and he's not just Because Severian is still dominant, right, in a certain way. Thecla is more present, right, than all the other personalities are, but he's still Severian, right? So Thecla is modulating his personality, but I do think she's subordinate to Severian himself. I don't think it's
you're right, which speaks to your earlier point. I don't think it's a controversial point. I think it's a valid point. I think that it was common wisdom of the last 10,000 years. So it can't be controversial. And heck, my wife says this to me all the time, that she civilizes me. And it's true. There's like a mountain of data to back up what you're saying. I was reading an article recently. I forget what outlet it was in, but if you even look at, and this is just speaking to the point that women civilize men, because we're fallen creatures and men are beasts, and women do civilize us. And if you look at countries in which there aren't enough women for the men, so for example, there are countries in the Middle East in which the rich, like oil, the rich oil tycoon people, thinking of places like Saudi Arabia and other countries like that, where they will take a bunch of wives and they'll take the stock of wives away from the men. And what happens then is rape goes up, murder goes up, and the men are like these hyenas that prowl around. Men behave much better when they're civilized by that gentler touch. Come at me, guys. I don't care. And so I fundamentally believe that, but I also think there's a deeper point about you were talking about, I think you could also talk about the shadow self, not to get all Jungian there, but just the idea that you not only need to incorporate your feminine side. And I don't think this is controversial. Ask women if they want men to have a feminine side. They will all say yes. To have a feminine side, to have that part of you that can be gentle and that can be loving and that can be not a tyrant, but that can be sweet and understanding and that sort of thing. And to see the world through women's eyes, I think that's very important. That's called empathy.
Right. Also, at the same time, though, that shouldn't lead, right? Because that's not what they want either. If you're just a wreck all the time, right?
No, of course not.
Yeah. Because you still need to be able to.
No, of course not.
Sing the Mulan song.
Which is why if you do a study of the types of books women like to read, and guys, I'm not making this up. This isn't a sexist point at all. It's just literally data. If you look at some of if you look at the books that women like to read most, they're about pirates and billionaires. And what else?
I know this, and like vampires
and vampires.
Yeah.
And if you just look at the data of the books that women buy, they're about women. It's the plot of Beauty and the Beast. They're about women civilizing pirates and sailors and billionaires and bringing them to heel, so to speak. But I also want to add the point about the shadow self is that there's an important point about, in order to be a ruler, you have to have that kind of dark side of yourself. You have to have that part of yourself that kicks in when you need to be cruel. And again, you don't want to lead with cruelty. It's like what your karate teacher tells you. You're not walking around with these things ready to punch people. It's that you need to know those skills. You need to have that bite to you so that bite can come out when it needs to come out, because every one of us needs to have a little bit of bite, a little bit of toughness. And Severian he has that shadow self. He was a torturer.
Right. And so I have to slightly spoil one thing from Earth.
Go ahead.
And that is that when Severian gets to where he's going, right, he arrives as the epitome of Earth. That is the title that he has announced when he gets to where he's going. And it's assigned to him by the Hierodules. It's not something he asks for. And so that is what he's becoming. He's becoming sort of the avatar, in a sense, of all humankind, right? So that's why he's such an ugly person on the inside, is because we are, right? That's why he has a feminine aspect, right? That's why he has all of these parts of him that are dead, right? Because most of humanity is dead, right? And so as he says several times, right, we're outnumbered by the dead, beyond counting. And so he's got that aspect as well. And he ends up being judged by all of the people that he's ever met, basically, right? And I won't go any farther, but that is what his story is building him into, right? Is humanity, right, in essence. And so it's appropriate, right, that he undergoes this sort of, Jungian Campbellian hero's journey, because, talking about earlier, these epicycles, right? That's what we're all doing, right? Everybody's life is a sort of Sisyphean effort to like push your rock uphill, right? Whatever that rock may be, right? Now, I obviously as a Catholic would point out that that's like what the crucifixion is, and minimum, right? You can lump that down with all the other myths from human tradition and say, oh, it's another example of that, right? So I'm not asking anyone, you don't have to believe in that literally, right? To get the point, right? But like all that, what we're trying to do is sort of imitate that heroic struggle and sacrifice. And Severian is acting that out in his life, as all of the previous autarchs attempted to varying degrees of success, because only I think 2 of his predecessors actually make the trip like he did, and failed. The others didn't even make it that far. And so, they're all acting it out, right? Thecla has her own story. Everybody has their own story, right? And so Severian comes to represent the essential struggle of everyone going through that individual story when humanity itself goes to be judged, right? And so, yeah, so the whole story is about sort of accumulating a complete person, right? For that final judgment. I don't remember exactly where I was going with that.
He's like, in a way,
yes, right?
Yeah, in a way, Christopher, he's like the meta autarch, right? It very much reminds me of, given the fact that he has all of these, individuals in his head, it very much is like Burke's point about inherited wisdom, about, think about how difficult life would be if you had to think up everything from scratch, right? We don't even have to think about what's edible, for example, because it's all been tested out. We don't even have to think about how to make these dishes, how to make food, the kind of food that we cook every day, because it's all been tested out to the nth degree, and everything that goes into it. And that applies to standardization and pretty much everything else that you can think of. So I think that the point that you're making is very important.
Yeah, this was a point I almost forgot to make when I was talking about how Severian is still Severian, right? Despite the Thecla persona, despite all these, right? Is he never changes his name, right? And that's the important part. All those other sub-personalities are still subordinate to his will in at least completeness, right? Because he's still all there. Thecla is more or less all there, right? So she's sort of second, right? But Appian and Emar and all of the other, autarchs, Maxentius, whatever, right? They are they're not as present, right? They're still like, he is ruling himself, right? Autarch means self-ruler, right? And so he's literally the first among equals of this sort of, Senate in his head, right? And so this relates to the growing up thing, right? Because you're supposed to be, right? This is the whole idea of the liberal arts, right? They're supposed to set you free from yourself, right? So that you were able to pursue higher things. You were supposed to sort of master your own ignorance and your own in virtue, right? And so that's what he's doing, right, as well, right? He's subordinating the darker part of himself, right, the shadow self, as you say, along with all these other things, and that's what makes him not just the autarch, but that makes him a man, right? And this is why I had that fundamental issue with the characterization of what the Kwisatz Haderach should be as well. I think Frank Herbert has the basic, plan there precisely correct, right? Because Paul, like the danger in Dune, brief tangent, right, is that any one of those old personas could possess you, right? The way that Alia gets possessed by the Baron Harkonnen in book 3, right? Some part of the past you could identify with some dysfunction in yourself. In Alia's case, it's lust, right? And the Baron is lascivious, right? So he kind of like, makes a deal, like, I'll take just a portion of your mind, and then he makes a play for all of it by the end of book 3, right? And that's not the central struggle in New Sun, but it's the same essential mechanism that's playing out, right? Is Severian needs to set his house in order internally, right? Before he can go out and save the world. And that is really what the Book of the New Sun is about, I guess.
Yeah, and I really enjoy your point. I think it's a point that most people don't understand. I like your point about growing up and your connection there to the liberal arts and the way in which the original idea of the liberal arts was to enable you to be free. But that freedom, that idea of freedom is the classical idea of freedom, which isn't license, right? Or freedom to just do whatever the heck you want, consequences be damned, or even like sort of Lockean negative liberty. But the idea of freedom as freedom from yourself, freedom
right.
from
people like have forgotten that you can oppress yourself, right?
Right.
By being addicted to something or compulsive in some way, right? Even to something silly, right? Like, I'm a real monster without my coffee. Like, no, you're not. Grow up, right?
I know.
Like, coffee's great, sure, right? But like, you don't have to be a jerk before you have it. That's like a really silly example, but obviously people struggle with, all sorts of things. Sorry, I'm rambling.
No, yeah, I just think that that's an important point to make, is that the very long held classical definition of freedom was not sort of freedom from your right to be messed with while you're trying to take heroin, but rather freedom was the idea of inner freedom. I was reading a book recently called The Unbroken Thread, and there was a story told about Father Maximilian Kolbe and sacrificing his life in Auschwitz to save the lives of these other prisoners, so that like this family could live. He stepped into their place and said, kill me. And the book was arguing that this is an example of inner freedom, the idea that who among us actually has the freedom to give up our lives? Like, I don't have that kind of freedom. I'm way too narcissistic. I'm way too, I'm such a decadent man. I'm part of my therapeutic culture. But the idea of inner freedom is the idea that you have the freedom to master, you have the freedom to control yourself. You have the freedom to abstain from things that are legitimately bad for you. And not everyone has that kind of freedom, being able to do what you say you're going to do. Freedom to govern yourself. That was the idea of the liberal arts, is that you would learn these skills that would enable you to govern yourself so that you wouldn't have to be governed by an authoritarian dictator.
Right, exactly. And so, again, doing the sort of Dune comparison here, right? Severian has to govern himself. He has to be the autarch. He kind of doesn't have a choice. It's not really a big struggle that he has. There are a couple bits early on where he'll say something and it's someone else speaking and he's not sure who it is, but he gets that under control. But if he weren't to do that, right, this could very easily be a sort of Children of Dune retread, right? And we could run through the Alia abomination plot. But that's obviously not where the book goes. But like, that is sort of symbolically speaking, it's sort of all symbolically speaking the same language. I dropped my pen. And so that's it's interesting that these two like giant series of science fiction, maybe the two giant series of science fiction, at least, well, that's not true. People will go to Foundation or something. They shouldn't. This is better. But, but that these two great works of science fiction touch on precisely this really like complicated and like kind of out there thing. It is not obvious that this should be something that two science fiction writers talk about ever, right? Because it's very removed from positronic brains and space elevators, right? And so it's neat.
One thing I wanted to ask you, kind of, you can stay as much as you want on Sword, but just moving kind of into Citadel, is how much of the story, Christopher, do you think is real? How much of the story do you think is real, and how much of it is a concoction of Severian's memory and his imagination and his own defense mechanisms and his psychic delusions, right? I know that you're very familiar with this question because it's a question that one might ask of Sun Eater, which is, Hadrian looking back and telling this story from his perspective as someone looking back, and the way in which you have to question the reliability of the narrator. So I was wondering what you thought of that.
All right. So full spoilers, right?
Yeah.
I think that it is far more reliable than people give it credit for. for a couple of reasons. The first sort of basic level is if none of the story is true, right, then there's no point because none of the story is true. Severian doesn't exist, right? You know, Gene Wolfe did not receive this manuscript in a lead-lined coffer that was thrown through a wormhole by Severian in the first chapter of Earth of the New Sun, right? Like, it did not happen, right? That's not real. This is a fake story that Gene Wolfe made up. And so if it's all a lie, like in context, like if it's all diegetically a lie, right? Then like there's no point in even reading, right? Because it's already a lie already, because it's fiction. So we have to sort of assume that like canonically, right, in story, that like this is broadly happening. There must be a Severian who's probably a torturer, right? He had, you know, he helped Mercy kill this prisoner. He got sentenced. Like all of that, I think, happened, right? Canonically. I think that when he is lying, it's to make himself look better. The first chapter in Shadow, he never says he kills that guy, right? He doesn't admit that he kills that guy, I think, until Earth of the New Sun. It might be in Citadel. I can't remember. But he never says, I killed that guy until, like, the book that Gene didn't even intend to write, right? And
I thought I read that in Citadel.
Oh, it's in Citadel? Okay.
I thought I read that in Citadel.
Yeah,
like,
you're probably right, because I like went right into Earth, and I'm like halfway into Earth now, so the barrier is a little bit thin for me. In any case, you know, so I think he lies in a lot of face-saving ways, right? Like he really does sort of elide, like he skips the Jolenta rape scene, right? And with good reason, right? Like, you know, that's awful, right? Duh. You know, what more needs to be said? But he also, right, but he does go and then look at the consequences of it, right, to a certain extent, even though he's still like he doesn't make himself look very good in those scenes. So I don't know if he's like trying to express some guilt indirectly by not also acknowledging the problem. But the point is he lies a lot by omission. I don't think he lies by commission very much. And I think that a lot of the other lies and the discontinuities that manifest the narrative, right? Because he claims to have perfect memory. I think he believes that, right? I think the problem with Severian's memories is they aren't all his, and he can no longer tell which are and which aren't. There are a couple times, you know, we talked about this, I think, in the last video, where he will remember his childhood, but he's remembering Thekla's childhood, and he doesn't outright say it's Thekla's childhood sometimes, right? He will say sometimes, you know, that, you know, he, you know, was that girl Thekla, or he'll reference his father, right? He doesn't know his father, although he does meet his father in the books.
Yes.
So I think it's mostly like that. And the other thing too is because of the claw and the powers of the claw, which he has always possessed, because they aren't the claw's powers, they're his powers, because he is the conciliator, he is the new sun, and has always been the new sun, though he does not know it. Means that like sometimes he can bring his own memories back inside of his own head, the way that he's bringing back Dorcas from the dead, the way he heals people. He sometimes basically heals his own brain. And so when he has these moments where he's like overcome by memory and he's like having this sort of like waking lucid dream, it's because that's happening. And so all of this, there's so many different layers as to why Severian's brain does not work like a normal person's brain. And none of it is expressly spelled out, right? That it makes it very hard, and it makes him look less reliable than he is. I think that readers really like the postmodern thing, and they like the minute you have a first person narrator, people automatically call them unreliable narrators in science fiction circles. You know, as if like just like a person talking is just intrinsically unreliable, which is like true, like sure. Of course. Nobody is perfectly objective or even well informed. In fact, almost nobody is. Almost everybody is dumb and misinformed, right? That's just normal. But it doesn't mean he's malicious, right? And everyone like treats Severian, and they treat Hadrian too, in my own books, as if he's like totally like a liar and out to make himself look good and like pull the wool over people's eyes. For my part, I don't think Hadrian is deliberately told a lie ever, right? You know, maybe he's like his perceptions aren't very good because he's a person, right? And he doesn't have perfect memory or even think he does. But like I'm not setting out to like lie to people, right? They bring a lot of that in themselves, right? And maybe that says more about where our culture is or where those people are individually. We just assume dishonesty, but maybe it's always been that way. I don't know. I can only talk in terms of post-modernity, but yeah. So I don't really think Severian's unreliable, except for the fact that his brain is not normal, and boy is it not.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you make a really good point. And I always thought, when I read someone like Hadrian telling his story, when I read something like this, my thought is not that the narrator is, that the person telling the story is deliberately going out there to make stuff up and lie in this like really kind of calculated fashion, to go in there and like change the events and just, there's a great book by Harry Frankfurt about this, and it's called On Bullshit. And the argument that he makes is that there are three types of people in the world. There are liars, and those are, well, they're people that lie a lot. They're compulsive liars. Then there are honest people, and they're, people who are like generally concerned with always telling the truth. And then there are bullshitters. And bullshitters, he says, are worse. They're the worst of the bunch, because bullshitters don't actually care about the truth, respect it, or so the liar has to know what the truth is in order to conceal the truth, so that he can deliberately fool you about what the truth is and make you think the opposite of what the truth is. The bullshitter doesn't recognize truth at all, doesn't care about it, is more of a nihilist or a sociopath, and that sort of thing. And so I kind of have a high bar for that, because I think that most human beings are deluded. I think we are filled with these defense mechanisms and cognitive dissonances. I think that we tell ourselves stories to put ourselves to sleep at night. I think that we tell ourselves comforting things about our own personalities so that we can think well of ourselves and guard our fragile egos. So I think that all human beings are like that. And I think it would be really crappy to live in a world that wasn't like that, in which people didn't have dignity and there were just these, messes. But I always just assume that Hadrian is like that. He's like the rest of us. Like, he has certain things that he thinks about himself, and he's probably wrong about how he's perceived, but he can't perceive himself in any other way but in and through his own subjectivity. So,
right.
Yeah.
And this is too where the fact that this is fiction comes back into play, right? Because if you are reading someone's autobiography, right, they have way more incentive to lie, right? Especially if they're famous, right?
Yep.
If they're a politician, at minimum, because like they probably have state secrets or like illegal shit that they need to cover up, right? But like when it's fiction, right? Like, what are you going to do? Are you going to report Hadrian to the empire, like, because he wrote this book? You can't do that, right? Like, he has nothing to lose because he has nothing. He's not real, right? And so this is my fundamental reason for trusting even unreliable narrators, because if I don't, then like the story is pointless. And that feels like maybe a smooth brain take, but like it's really important to remember that this is fiction. And if nothing can be taken at face value, right, then it falls apart. All you're left with is a blank book. And so you kind of have to take Severian on faith. Otherwise there's no story. Now,
right.
Like, again, he's not consistent, and he totally like glosses over things. But like the fact that people know this and you can notice it, it's not like it's hard. Some of it's hard, but like the fact that he totally kills a guy, like in the first chapter, that's very easy to spot, and doesn't admit that he killed the guy. Right. That tells you pretty early on the kind of person you're dealing with, right? Which is to say, a person. And it's maybe a more honest first person account of a first kill than like I've done, or like any other fantasy writer's done, right? Yeah. Because like, of course you don't want to talk about it. Holy cow, right? You just killed the guy. Severian's like 14 and he just like shoves an axe in this dude's neck, right? Like, not talking about that ever. I feel terrible.
I thought you were talking about the people you killed, Christopher.
You caught me. You see this tiny skull? Oh no, you might not be able to. There's a tiny skull. Yeah, that's all that's left.
Oh man, you
That's his head
mentioned
down.
politicians' autobiographies. I'm just waiting for the first autobiography of any politician that just on the title is not like dreams of my ancestors or hopes of my forefathers. I wanted to just say like I'm a dirtbag.
It's just the geocache coordinates for where all the bodies are. Yeah, exactly.
I'm a
That would
dirtbag.
be honest, right? But you know, that's one of the things that like has given me existential crisis over the years is the degree to which history itself is not reliable because you have to like triangulate truth by looking at like archaeological data and like this guy's point of view and that guy's point of view, and then you have to I go dig a hole in the ground, you know, and then you're like, oh, actually the Battle of Crécy was over here. You know, it's not where we thought it was.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, it's difficult. But with fiction, like it has to count, or like you're just reading nonsense, right?
Right.
And nobody believes that fiction is nonsense, right? Like that's the thing, right? It's all lies, right? Severian doesn't exist. There is no new sun. There's no autarch, right? There's no ring or Mount Doom. There are no elves, unfortunately. Very sad. But like nobody reads those books like they're meaningless. And so if there's meaning in the book, right, and everybody agrees there's meaning in New Sun, you kind of have to trust the narrative to a certain extent, you know. And that's true of like all fiction, right?
Yeah.
You know, turns out Raskolnikov doesn't exist. Does that mean that the point is invalid? No, right? No, right? You
Yeah,
know,
we need a mythos. I would rather have a mythos that isn't true than no mythos at all. And this was something Plato admitted as much in the Republic, that the mythos would actually like deliberately not be true. The mythos would keep the citizens of his republic in line. But I do think that your point is correct about fiction. They may be lies in the kind of old-fashioned sense. Don't read fiction because they're all lies. But there's a truth at the bottom of it, right? A kind of story truth, a kind of metafictional truth that you can derive from it. Speaking of that, Christopher, I'm interested to hear, going back to the story, how much of the story you think is random? You know, how much do you think is random, and how much do you think is just a matter of events happening because they must happen? Right. So how much of what's happening is a consequence of Severian's free will, and how much of it is happening because Severian is actually being groomed in a way to become someone, to be someone? It's very similar to questions you could ask in Sun Eater. This question of how much, and with Greek mythology, how much, to what extent is Severian a puppet? To what extent are people intervening in the story, or aliens intervening in the story, and all of that?
well, the answer is yes, right? Because it's both, right? And this is where the Catholicism comes back in, and maybe this is one of the things that makes me better suited to talk about this than a lot of folks who talk about Wolfe, is that Severian has free will because we all have free will. Right. At the same time, there are forces, and they are divine forces, right, that are moving him and have a plan and a purpose for him. But he can ultimately choose to participate in that fullness, right? He has, because we have to participate in our own salvation, right? There's this struggle in Christianity, right, between justification by faith and by works, right? Almost nobody believes by works. People think Catholics believe that they don't, right? Like you need God's grace, right? There but for the grace of God go I, as the old saying goes, right? But like you can't just like sit back and do nothing, right? As sort of the sola fide right. People would have, right? You have to participate because this world matters, right? Like if for no other reason, the fact that people are suffering, right? This world matters, right? Even though there is an ultimate higher reality, and there's an ultimate higher reality in New Sun, right? There is the world of the Pan Creator. There are literal higher universes. And we'll talk about because that's where the energy for the New Sun comes from. It pours down from a higher universe into ours through a white hole to rejuvenate the sun itself, right? Because the sun is running out of sustainable, fuel mass, right? So fundamentally, what is happening is a science fictional problem. alien angels are going to open a wormhole into the sun, invent a bunch of hydrogen into it from heaven, basically, to rejuvenate the sun so that Earth will no longer be, affected by its dying sun. And the sun is only dying because some other alien, evil alien force put a black hole in the sun in the first place and slowly been eating out all the material, right? So there's a basic sci-fi, like mega structure, stellar engineering story going on here, just like 2001 and Jupiter turning into Lucifer, right? Just like that. Only, metaphysically a bit different. But in order to do this, they still, the angels, the hydrojewels, the aliens, technically the hydrojewels aren't the angels, the hydrogrammates are, but I think that's only in Earth that you learn this distinction. In any case, the hydrojewels are only going to do that if humanity is worth saving, right? But humanity must be worth saving because there's like this big time pretzel thing going on where like an earlier version of humanity in a previous universal cycle created the hydrojewels in the first place. And so they're going to do us a solid and make sure that we get created on the other end of the pretzel so that they can continue to exist. Because there's this whole big loop thing. Yeah, all of this is going on, and it's been going on for multiple universes, right? Severian talks about how there was an earlier cycle and there was another Severian, right? And people take that to mean there was literally another person named Severian, but that person might be Jesus, right? Like explicitly Jesus in an earlier universal cycle or a later one, probably a later one because Gene Wolfe is the one who receives this manuscript in this universe, right?
Right.
So we're probably down the chain. In any case, the cycle and the story have to repeat, right? And so early on, Severian goes to the brothel, he goes to the House of Jour, and the pimp there is the autarch, right, in disguise. Because he does odd jobs in his own empire, right? So that it's this really great bit where it's like sometimes, getting an imperial decree from the autarch is too much, right? Sometimes what you need really is a letter from the third bursar. And so I am also the third bursar, and I have a lot of fake IDs in my own empire. And one of them is I run this brothel where clones of all of my harem girls, serve people, right? And what the function of this brothel actually is to keep an eye out for the next one, right? Because it may be that the autarch gets, waxed and we need to like switch to a beekeeper or something real quick, but they're still trying to like groom a specific replacement, right? And that replacement is Severian, and there's a lot of weirdness with Severian's parentage, and it looks like he's part of some sort of project, right? And we never really get a full picture of what that is, right? But when he shows up, Father Rainier tells the autarch, that's the guy, right? We got to watch this one, right? And so when he shows up again, in the House Absolute carrying Vodalus's message, the autarch's like, oh shit, you are really the one, right? And so there has been this whole plan, right? The hydrojewels at the end of Citadel say like we are powers from above a stage, and he does a description of a Deus ex machina, right?
I know.
Actually, like outright, right? Which
okay, it is postmodern. You're right.
Who don't actually know, right? The Mekkane was a crane that the Greek theatrical performances used to like lower gods onto the stage. So it literally was a machine that lowered gods, right? And so Severian gets saved by the hydrojewels, and they literally explain, we are a power from above the stage come to lift you out, right? Like he's literally describing the action of the Mekkane, right?
That's brilliant.
And so obviously it's all been planned because but at the same time, if Severian wasn't up for it, he still has to be tested. He's still going to face judgment. He could still fail, right? And the clock is still running, right? The universe could wind down, right? Humanity could still die. It doesn't mean that providence, is guaranteed, right? Because humanity still has to choose. And another thing about this too is because we're talking about this universal like boom bust cycle, he uses the word apokatastasis, which I think you would like to know, right? If you don't already, is a Neoplatonic thing.
Yes,
right?
I know.
Yeah, okay, you do know. Yeah, they had this the Stoics, right? And the Neoplatonists had this concept of universal renewal, right?
Yes.
That the universe would would burn out, right? And it kind of in an entropic sense, right? Although they didn't have the physics for that, and that it would be sort of reignited, right, in the new cycle. And this is something that like it didn't quite make the cut into Christian theology, right? It was something that Origen, who kind of helped explicate the idea of the Trinity in the first place, really believed in, but it was one of the things that the church kind of nixed when they were, discovering, right, canon and working out theological questions. But Wolfe is pulling from these sort of like early Christian and like near Christian, in a sense, theological beliefs and sort of building this crazy world. So it's another historical reference. The very cycle of the cosmology here, right? This is, it's a universe that's set in a Neoplatonic Stoic, kind of universe, but at the same time is still deeply Christian, which is just another layer of the reference in here. But no, I think it's both, right? I think that humanity, in the form of its epitome in severity, must participate in salvation, but it is also all part of God's plan, which humanity can fall short of because humanity.
Yeah, that idea of eternal reoccurrence was actually later picked up by, of all people, Nietzsche. And Nietzsche called it the theory of eternal reoccurrence. And it's interesting because he used it. I only bring this up because I was thinking about it when I was reading. He used it as a thought experiment. His idea was that, okay, I probably, although there is some evidence that he actually believed this, but for the most part, he'd like to think of it as a poetic thought experiment. And he said, one of the best ways to live your life, and I think anyone of any faith can agree with this, even though Nietzsche called himself the Antichrist. One of the things he said was, you should live your life as if when you die, you go to this like metaphysical realm and you have to watch your life the way that you lived it in its entirety. Let's say you, Christopher, die when you're the ripe age of 110. Okay. And when you die, where you're going to go is this metaphysical realm. And I'll update it for modern times. Basically, you have to sit in a chair and watch your life on TV for eternity. And so Nietzsche said, live your life in such a way that if you were stuck in this realm for eternity, having to watch the life you lived over and over and over and over again, that you would actually be proud of it and would enjoy the movie. So I'm twisting his words a little bit because the way he put it is basically you have to live your life over and over again in your own body for eternity. And you have to watch yourself go through the same motions and do the same moves. Every moment of cowardice, every moment of stupidity, every stupid thing you said, every weird pickup line you delivered to a girl, you have to experience it all over again for eternity. And so live with that in mind so that you can live rightly and not make those same mistakes. Live such that when you go to watch that eternal movie, there are moments that you're like really proud of and stuff like that. That has nothing to do with this book, but I thought I'd share that with you, a little tangent there.
Yeah. So, I guess we haven't talked about like plot that much.
Yeah.
So, do we want to get into stuff like Typhon and Baldanders? We haven't talked about Baldanders at all.
Yeah, sure. Definitely. I was like really excited by the whole Baldanders twist there. I found that to be very exciting because I totally didn't expect it. Maybe I'm like a stupid reader, but I just totally didn't expect that Baldanders was actually the brilliant mad scientist and that Dr. Talos was his sort of homunculus.
Yeah.
I don't know what you thought about that.
Yeah, so I was talking about eternal recurrence, right? Because this is actually a good segue. There's actually a bit where I think it's Dr. Talos says to Severian, right? Like the pattern, Baldanders and I are leaving such a big mark on time that like our greatness is going to resonate throughout eternity, right? And kind of intimates that Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster are based on them, right? And that the future is also affecting the past, right? There's a line somewhere about how it's sort of like the circumstances of the past obtained today, right? And it kind of plays in in both directions, right? And so that was really fun, right? Because time isn't linear, as we see. We go through we have this sort of cyclical universe boom bust thing going on. So the patterns sort of repeat, and maybe it's like some information survives from one incarnation of the universe into the next, but also there are just some resonances because people do in fact go back in time in this. And there will be more of that in Earth. And because of that nature of the sort of porous nature of time, these stories are inspiring the other stories. And so in a sense too, right, the Theseus stuff, right, the Mowgli stuff, the Romulus stuff might in fact be, right, even the actual historical events are recurrences of these final, critical moments, right, because of human history, the end of human history, right, is sort of playing back across time in little epicycles, right? And so that's just one real way, one way in which that's true. But what's so cool about Baldanders too, right, is he's a great villain. Is that he is pure reason, right? He is the materialist, rationalist, scientist. He throws the claw into the sea, right, or into the lake. Doesn't need it, doesn't believe in it, it's pointless. But he also won't give it to Severian because he's resentful of what it represents, right?
Right.
He's like, Faith, get out of here, right? And so they have this big fight, basically, right, between Severian as Faith in a sense and Baldanders as reason, and they have this cool, it reminds me of the opening scene from the Hugh Jackman freaking Van Helsing movie where he fights Mr. Hyde in Notre Dame, right? Because is fighting this big hulking giant, right, and he's got to like outfox him and stuff. So you've got Severian with the sword, right, trying to fight this giant. And it's just such a cool, like, weird sequence because Baldanders turns all the machines in his castle against Severian too, and they're like holograms trying to fight him, and he doesn't know what a hologram is, so it's like freaking him out. And there's
do we know how he did it exactly? Do we know how he was able to use his mad science to manipulate himself into this? So
that's the other thing, right? Yeah. Is he knows that like Earth has problems, right? He knows that not only is the sun going out, but like humanity is beset by these sort of Cthulhian monsters, and he's basically decided, I'm gonna be one. And I don't, it's not clear if his like intention is to take on Erebus or if he just wants to like extend his own life and like become more advanced and evolved. Maybe he's just most likely he's selfishly just trying to escape Earth by becoming like one of these things because they can, sort of swim into space themselves, right? Being kind of, old ones, right? But he's sort of pushing his own evolution, right? So he can heal like Wolverine, basically, right? He heals really fast because he's constantly growing, right? But the cost is that he gets sleepy and eventually he's going to have to move into the sea. But it like brings him closer symbolically to those monsters, right? And Erebus, Abaya, and there's another one, I forget the third one's name. It's only mentioned like once or twice.
These Askian creepy monsters that run this like 1984
state, creepy. Right? But what they are, right, is they're demons, right? Symbolically, right? They're aliens, sure, but they're like alien demons, right? Because we have alien angels, but they're here to destroy mankind, right? Or at least to rule it, which in a sense could be the same thing. Because if all of Earth is Askia, like humanity's dead, right?
Right. Or we become their meat puppets, which is dead.
There's nothing left, right? Because there's a point about the Askians too, because the Askians are so fascinating, right? Where they all like look the same, and it's heavily implied that like there's a lot of cloning going on to like keep their numbers up, because like the Askian soldiers will just commit suicide. Like they aren't given weapons until like the last minute because the morale is so low, they like kill themselves en masse, right? They're like not really people anymore. They don't have names, although like the spark's not gone, right? Because there is that chapter where the one tells his story, and he's still, he's trying to get with the girl, right? He's, there's still hope, right? But there's just, but there's this bit, right? Because they like all appear to be clones. There's a line where it says that like the Askians are trying to, solve like the problem of humanity by making all of humanity one person, by which they just mean everybody's the same, right? And it really like, I maybe have a reputation for making fun of communism a lot, but like there is something intrinsically demonic about it, right?
Communism has a reputation for killing 100 million people in the 20th century. So I would say that it's not you, man.
Yeah, well, no, but someone was a little upset with me in the last couple of days about this point because I also have space communists, right? And in any case, so it's a sort of a recent thing. But the point is, right, is they aren't associated with these demons by accident, right? Because what they are doing is destroying humanity, right? And this is a sort of symptom of that destruction. Is the system, and what it's doing is by sort of enforcing order so rigidly that humanity can't exist anymore, right? By destroying precisely that freedom, right, that we were talking about earlier, the freedom to be your best self, right? Like actually your best self. They are able to sort of, bring humanity to heal. And that's one of the possible futures that's represented here. But the fact that Baldanders is coming to resemble those demons by his rejection of the sort of Pancreator's plan, right? By rejecting the claw and by embracing his own genius, the fact that that brings him closer to Erebus, to Abaya, to the Askians themselves, right? Is certainly Gene Wolfe saying something, right, about the dangers of pure reason. It's pure reason that turns, Dr. Frankenstein into Frankenstein's monster, right? Because of course, like the canard about that book, because I guess we could bring the Shelleys back in some form here, right? Is that like knowledge is knowing that Frankenstein wasn't the monster, wisdom is knowing that he was, right? And in this case, it's made literally true, right? In the character of Baldanders, to whom Tylos is really an amusing sort of adjunct, right? Because all he's there for really is to obfuscate Baldander's reality in a certain sense, right? And to be the funniest character. I love Dr. Talos. And so but Baldanders is really the thing, right? He's a big deal, and he will play a role again in Earth. We'll look at here in a bit.
Yeah, I like your point about pure reason. And there's a book that I teach every year to my AP students, and it's called The Righteous Mind, and it's by Jonathan Haidt. He's, just, this isn't really original thoughts or anything like that, but he actually ran some tests on this. And one of the reasons that you can't have a society that operates on the basis of pure reason is that reason is good at doing some fairly narrow things, but reason isn't good for everything. And also, we really suck at reason. We're like really, really bad at reasoning. And the point that he makes in that book is we can reason well if we have institutionalized disconfirmation, as he calls it, which means that you have an institution that has checks and balances. The peer review process, although it's fallen apart, it was based on this idea that if you had a scientific theory to propose, there'd be someone who disagreed with you on the other end to challenge you in a way that you wouldn't be able to challenge yourself because you don't actually share their bias. But one of the interesting points so we can reason well in groups that are heterodox, but we're very bad at reasoning alone. We're very much driven by confirmation bias and by motivated reasoning. But one of the points he makes in that book is that you actually need your gut level intuitions. We tend to think that you always want to be operating rationally, like logico philosophicus, homo economicus. Yeah, were you going to say something?
Yeah, what's so funny about this is one of the quotes that you had me pull out because you asked me to find a few is precisely about this. So we can just knock it out right now. He says, the progress of science depends much less upon theoretical considerations or systematic investigation than is commonly believed, but rather on the transmittal of reliable information gained by chance or insight from one set of men to their successors. The nature of those who hunt after dark knowledge is to hoard it even unto death, or to transmit it so wrapped in disguise and be clouded with self-serving lies that it is of little value. I'm just glad that I happened to pick one that was precisely
at
about
times
that.
One hears those who teach their lovers well or their children, but it is the nature of such people seldom to have either, and it may be that their art is weakened when they do. That is literally right after the quote that you just read. It's the next line. We picked out the same quote.
Oh, awesome. Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah. And that's That's
Making fun of
excellent.
scientists is always fun.
Oh
Not
yeah, it's
because they
great.
aren't serious people, but because they take themselves too seriously.
I know. My wife's a scientist and she knows this.
Mine
And
too.
that's her like common gripe is that other scientists don't know as much as they think that they do. And she actually gives lessons on the scientific method where she talks about the way in which you are not seeking to prove a hypothesis. That is not what you are seeking to do in science. You are seeking to take that hypothesis and you are seeking to disprove it. And if you can't disprove it, then what you say is, "Oh, I haven't been able to disprove it yet." That's it. That's your job as a scientist.
Right. This is why we stopped calling things laws. Right.
Right.
And this is why we have theories about things,
Right.
theories of general relativity, because we disproved Newtonian physics, right? Newtonian physics is applicable, right?
It's applicable.
Is applicable,
Here.
but we can only approach these truths, asymptotically, right? Our theories will get more accurate provided that we continue to have a culture that maintains the economy that allows for us to answer these questions, right? And maybe we'll run into some hard limitations, right? Maybe human senses or language like actually don't allow us to reconcile, general field theory. Like maybe we can't reconcile quantum mechanics and relativity. I wouldn't be surprised if it's beyond us. It might be, right? But we will keep trying to refine our theories, and our ability to do stuff within the confines of our own knowledge will continue to expand. But there's an upper limit on that.
Yeah.
Somewhere, right? There must be. And that's what I like to make fun of, right? People just sort of assume that, time is linear, but like progress is, right? And it's not, right? In no field is progress linear. We just think that because microchips keep getting smaller, right? But like that does not apply to social structures. It doesn't apply to psychology. It doesn't apply to literary criticism.
Right.
So I don't want people to think that I'm being like, against scientists or anything here. Just Baldanders, because that dude is he's
no. We have
guy.
to have humility though, and Haidt's point. He makes this really interesting point that pure reason. It's really great when you're doing math, okay, and it's really great when you're trying to solve certain problems. And again, you need like a peer review process. But a world of pure reason would be one of the examples he uses is. There are some cases in which you could use pure reason to arrive at killing your grandmother for some reason. And this is a point going back to the whole thing about Raskolnikov killing the landlady, is that you can justify that using reason. And so Haidt's point is reason has to be, of course, he uses the rider and the elephant metaphor. But it is actually your feelings and it's actually your intuition. And it's that feeling in your gut that stops you from killing your mother when you're angry at her. It is not reason.
Right. And it's your ethical enculturation too, right? Yes. Because like incorporating your shadow self, reason too must be subordinated, right? And this is part of Severian's lesson in overcoming Baldanders, right? Is that he learns not to be that person. Because this is a huge moment for him, right? His sword gets broken, right? It's a really cool thing too, because Terminus S can bleed, right? The sword itself can bleed. And so he loses this symbol upon which he had staked his entire identity for the first 3 books, right? It is gone, right? And he has to reevaluate who he is. He's already resolved to not be a torturer, right? Because he ran away from Thrax already because it wasn't fulfilling him. It wasn't the right thing. Because fundamentally, being a torturer is not the right thing, right? And this is another sort of arc that gets closed in the series too, is dealing with the institution of torture, right? Especially as it's decayed in Severian's time. But he finally has to let go of that in a concrete sense. And it is beating up against Baldanders as an obstacle that destroys the last of those illusions and forces him to become something else. And he doesn't know what that something else is going to be at the end of the book. But it is that encounter with the brute force nature of pure reason that forces him to change, because he knows that was wrong, right? He knows not to be Baldanders if he knows nothing else in that moment.
Yeah, Christopher, that really raises a question that I wanted to ask you is you talked about Baldanders being a fairly good bad guy, and you talked about the kind of fight between pure reason and faith between Severian and Baldanders, and it raised this question for me of, and I know I don't want to oversimplify things, but this question of whether the autarch and that whole side of the world, the autarky, are these the good guys? Right? It's very much, in my opinion, you're playing with similar themes in Sun Eater. Is the Solan Empire and the Emperor, they do horrible things, but are they the good guys in this very strange way? So I'm wondering what you think about this in Book of the New Sun, whether we can see in the end, once we get through book 4, the autarky as representing our best approximation of the good guys.
Well, yes and no, right? Because the question that I need to ask back is, what do you mean by the autarky, right? Because we learn in Citadel that it isn't really what you think, right? Yeah. It turns out that basically the entire government of the Commonwealth hates the autarch, and wants to betray him, wants to destroy him, right? And so he's this little nuclear kernel that's still trying to fight the good fight, when the entire middle management, the sort of managerial elite of the empire, have all sold out, right? They're like, Vodalus is just the sort of tip, he's the visible tip of the evil iceberg, right? Almost all of the nobility, right? Thekla has this sort of Kraken bracelet, that armlet that she wears, right? And the Kraken is a sea monster, right? It is symbolically associated with the demons, right? And and so what's interesting about this, right, is the sequel that Tolkien never wrote to Lord of the Rings, The New Shadow, was about a Sauron worshipping sort of cult that had taken hold in Gondor and Arnor right after the death of Eldarion, Aragorn's son. And he didn't want to write it, right? But that is the condition of the autarky that we find in New Sun, right? And I'm sure that Wolfe wasn't really aware of this, because I don't know that New Shadow was something people really knew about until the last couple of decades, right? And this was the 80s. But we find the last sort of orthodox vestiges of humanity, right? Because the autarch's supposed to rule not just Earth, but like the whole galactic empire. He only rules like South America, right? Mm-hmm. North America is completely overrun by the Askians, right? We have no real idea about much of the old world, except there are a couple of references to the Xanthic lands, right? And Xanthic is yellow in Greek, right? So it must be like China's out there in some capacity, or what it's become at least. But like, it's all gone, right? And even the Commonwealth is eaten through with deep, deep corruption, right? And now, like, do they have an interest in like maintaining their sort of borders and like, because they don't want to be Askians? Sure, right? But the autarch's pretty clear about this. Like, if he gave himself over to Erebus, like right now, the war would end and the Commonwealth would be left alone, because what Erebus and Abaya want is not immediately the subjugation of everybody, right? Like, perfectly willing to let those self-interested, elites in the Commonwealth fritter away everything, with their wealth and their parties and die out, and they'll take over eventually, right? They'll overrun things eventually, but what they want is for the autarch to go away, because it is only the autarch, right, as the sort of divinely appointed ruler of humankind, who can actually defeat them. Because the only thing that's getting rid of them is the New Sun, right? It's the only thing that's going to destroy them. And so that's really the issue. The autarch is the good guy, right? Because he, even though it's going to come at a great cost, right? Because, this is one of those like really muddy things, because, and I run into this criticism a lot too, because what Hadrian does in his story is wipe out, an entire alien species, right? Is that a good thing, right? And also there's a lot of collateral damage, but he's told to do this by a higher power, right? And it's not consequentialism, right? It's providence, right? And it's not consequentialism when it's providence. And so I do think that the horrific side effects, like the flood in Genesis, is not consequentialism, right? It's an act of God. And sometimes God's instruments are other people, right? Whether that's, speaking scripturally, right? Whether that's Joshua and the Amalekites, right? Or, which is a very troubling section, understandably, right? But like, it's still an act of God, right? Or it's the plagues in Exodus, or it's Christ redeeming humanity, right? By living out his heroic epicycle, right, that we're supposed to be templating our lives on.
But
right?
it's not consequentialism, and it's not deontology, and it's not virtue ethics. It's something entirely different.
It's something else, and it's something that, for as central as it is to Western culture, we still don't really have a word for except Christianity. And that's and like, I know a lot of people want to read this book and not read it as a Christian book. I'm incapable of doing so, and I think that if you read it in any other way, you're not reading it like to its full extent. So I don't want to turn people off reading it because of how religious it is. I know this is a sort of a problem. There are a lot of people, who just don't want to read religious books. This is not preaching at you, right? This is exploring the like central mythological subtext of Western civilization in a science fictional way. That's not preaching, right? That's like so many levels deeper than preaching. Like, don't worry about it, right?
But it's your culture. I mean, it literally is your culture, if you like it or not. I mean, there was a book that came out recently that was all about, and I know that you read some of it as well, the way in which how many of the things that we take for granted and that we think are just part of our secular culture are actually the fruits of Christianity.
Is that Dominion by Tom Holland?
That's the one.
Yeah. That's a great book. He started to lose me in the Reformation, but so did the Reformation. But no, he's great. He's great. I love Dynasty too.
I haven't read it.
It's his Julio-Claudian Dynasty book. And the Julio-Claudians are a fascinatingly dysfunctional family. So it's a good read. But no, so like the autarchs are on the side of good, even if they're not necessarily good in themselves. As Severian is not necessarily a good person. He keeps getting better, right? And I really like Severian by the end of the series. But you have to get through a lot of grime, right? And that's humanity too, right? Like, if you ask people if they like humanity, right, they'll say yes. But if you ask them if they like people, they usually say no, right? And it's sort of that distinction that you need to keep in mind when you think about Severian as a person and about the autarch as a sort of person of persons. Is precisely that sort of distinction. So yeah, I think they are on the side of good.
Yeah, you do see this attitude, and I think it is a disturbingly modern attitude. You mentioned that if you ask people if they like humanity, I would even question. I even think if you ask people if they like humanity these days, if the person is an environmentalist, and I consider myself an environmentalist. I'm not insulting environmentalists. And so you do see this anti-humanist strain. I was talking in one of my classes, and this girl raised her hand. And this was my fantasy and sci-fi class. And we were talking about post-apocalyptic fiction. And I was running through the history of that genre. And I was talking about Lucifer's Hammer. And I was talking about some other post-apocalyptic book. And I was talking about saving the world so that humanity can be saved. And this girl raised her hand and she said, "Are you kidding me? Why would you want to save humanity?" And I said, "Well, why wouldn't you want to save humanity?" And she said, "Because we're a cancer. And we suck." And unfortunately, this is that anti-humanist strain that human beings are a cancer, they're a plague. And so what I said to her, and this just silenced her. Not that I silence my students, but when I made this comment, she didn't know what to do with it. I said, "So you actually would want everyone on earth to die? You want everyone on earth to die?" She was like, "Yeah, pretty much." And I said, "So what you're telling me is you want my wife to die?" And she went, "Oh." And I said, "No, you're literally saying that you want my wife to die. She's one of, your mother. It's like you have to, it's that Stalin thing of a million people being a statistic.
Yeah.
One person being a tragedy. And I just can't jibe with that anti-humanist. I'm a humanist all the way.
Yeah. So, well, in the general sense, not in the not in the
No, not
18th.
in the like Sam Harris, like secular humanist,
Yeah.
like Four Horsemen of.
But no, I'm being a bit sharp, I suppose.
Yeah.
I see a chance to dunk on the 18th century, and I take it. It's just sort of it's ingrained in my being at this point.
Oh.
But yeah, so
Hey,
no,
Christopher, what did you make of the ending? I'm curious. I know that's a big question, but I just wanted to get your take on the ending. Like there are a bunch of different theories and takes. Is Dorcas Severian's grandmother?
100%.
What's that?
100%.
100%.
Yes. Yes, it's very uncomfortable, and I don't know what to make of that. Actually, I still don't understand the bit there, except that it points to the fact that Severian's mother is a very shadowy, questionable figure and may have been one of the like Kaibits from the like the clones of the Autarch's concubines, and so involved in this sort of project to bring Severian himself about. I don't know why she needs to be brought back. I don't understand yet why because they have a relationship, right? And they don't know, right, that they are related. And as soon as Zorkas figures it out, she leaves, right? Because holy shit. Fortunately, she does not poke her eyes out like certain Greeks I might name. And she goes off to try and figure out what happened to her. But no, they're totally related. As far as I can tell, it's just to point a finger at these shadowy circumstances of Severian's birth, because they're already obscured by the fact that he's taken in by the guild, right? And may have been deliberately put there, right? Like some people think that his mother is the maiden who performs the role of Catherine in the ceremony. And that she basically is like kept in stasis and is brought out for this, right? But is somehow like part of, maybe she's descended from some old, noble family or something. That's all super unclear. But there is, I think, a 10-year gap between really the end of the narrative and Severian setting out to leave, because he has to set the Commonwealth in as much order as he can. He manages to like secure the borders. Basically, this is all like within the last couple chapters.
I know.
Right? When this is all stuff I would love to see, right? You're a court politics guy. I'm a court politics guy. I want to see this crap, right? I want to see Severian the Great, right? Beloved of his soldiers, hated by his courtiers, right? Just running roughshod over all these noobs. And I think it would be awesome. But he glosses over all of that, basically, marries Valeria, right, who is from some antique, house that's sort of been forgotten about, and lives Gormenghast style in the ruins of the Citadel, right? And the series ends with him walking in basically to propose marriage to her, right? And the computer, because one of the cool things about being Autarch is that all the like he has root access to like all of the Commonwealth's computer systems. So all the computers just start recognizing him everywhere. So he can just like, he has the words of power, i.e. the passcodes to like open doors and stuff. So he goes on this like return home tour at the end that like kind of is a scouring of the Shire kind of thing, right? Where he gets to go back, but like, he's not the same anymore. My favorite scene in the whole series is when he goes back to Master Palyman. Sorry, my Game of Thrones leaked in there a second. Master Palyman, and Master Palyman doesn't even recognize him, right? Is his favorite student. And we learned a lot too that like Palyman had been out and exiled like Severian was, and came back and had been this sort of wandering. So he's sort of like a proto Severian in a sense. It's another one of those like little recurrences, right? And so they have this moment and they talk about the future of the guild. And this is my favorite scene. This is the one like 4-paragraph stretch that lives in my head rent free, is when he explains to Palyman that he's going to undo the guild because torture is wrong, because men should not be employed to be torturers, right? By our mercy, he says, we will grant even the foulest a quick death, right? And Master Palyman mounts the defenses that Severian himself had mounted to Dorcas at the beginning of Sword of the Lictor, right? It would be so much worse, because he says, like, good men should not spend their lives dispensing pain, right? And he said it'd be so much worse if it was bad men, right? He's like, no, you misunderstand me. Nobody's going to do it, right? He's like, well, you could do all sorts of things. You could call it, we do healing. That's been done before, right? You could expand the prisons, right? But then you'll find out you have a lot of like, basically a whole army in chains, and they don't like you, which, is apropos. And so Severian settles on like a swift and painless capital punishment is like the best thing for serious criminals, right? And then he releases almost he doesn't release, no, not almost everybody. He releases those prisoners that deserve to be released. The like creepy serial killer that like makes furniture out of children, like he does not let go, right?
Right.
And so he goes through the cells, right? He explores, things a little bit, and then he goes and finds Valeria and proposes marriage, and that is like the start of his reign, basically, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so he has to go set everything in order, and then he closes the book. He puts his pen down, saying, like, I'm getting on the spaceship tomorrow. I am going to bring the new sun. And for the purposes of these 4 books, which were supposed to be a complete series, we know he's gonna do it, right? Because all of the clues are in there that Severian is the conciliator himself, not only because he had the claw and it worked for him, and not only because it worked for him after he lost the claw, right? He can just work miracles on his own. But because the story, right, about the conciliator, which we now know Severian is, right, ends with him bringing the new sun, right? Because he's gonna come back with it. So we already know that, right? And the play that tells this whole story, right? Dr. Talos's play tells the future of the story and how the sun is going to come, can only possibly have arrived in the past if it came back from the future when it had been accomplished. So by the Doctor Who time loop property of it must be true, we must know that he brings the new sun, but he does not do it on the page. We have to figure it out by time loop.
I'm totally with you. Now, what do you make of the divine year and, what do you make of the secret history of time and the divine year and all of this very strange kind of physics stuff? Does Wolfe believe in like multiple universes, right? The idea that this alien race has figured out how to survive until the end of the universe and move into the next like phase of the universe, the next year. What do you make of all of that? And where Wolfe stands on that? Where do you go once you've figured out how to survive into the next phase, how to pass from our universe, not into the next one, but yeah, how do you make sense of that? I just read this hours ago and I'm struggling to wrap my head around it.
So I think he believes in a form of it, right? Because as a Catholic, you're like, you have to, right? Like there is a next world, right?
That's one way of putting it.
Right. Like it's compulsory. And so there is a next universe, right? And it's not the afterlife, right? There's literally a new universe, right, that comes at the end of Revelation, right? And everybody is resurrected body and soul, right? Like there is just a new universe and it will not be a fallen one, right? Now where Wolfe takes the science fiction thing a little bit, right, is like maybe the next one falls too, right? Maybe
he does like a Noah's Ark, a great flood.
Yeah. And there is a flood coming, right? Because the sun's gravity will change as it remasses, and that will have an effect on the tides. So that symbolism will play in Earth when we get there. But yeah, no. So he does believe in a form of recurrence. He's doing a science fiction take, right? He's trying to like build a science fictional explanation for for in a sense his own beliefs, right? Because he's trying to, in the same way, and this is something that I wanted to do about and work even before I read Wolfe, right? And this is why I've said before, if I'd read Wolfe before I started, I wouldn't have started because it's like already done, right? It is that in the same way that Tolkien is sort of he's writing fantasy because the past is an enchanted time. Wolfe is in a sense enchanting the future. Right, that's why this is post-historical in the same way that like Lord of the Rings is prehistorical, right? It's this sort of magical other time. But by saying the future can be enchanted too in this mythological sense, right? He's staking his own claim, right? And like Wolfe is a scientist, right? He was an engineer, right? And he's saying those things are reconcilable, right? Right. But we talked about how reason needs to be subordinated, not so much to faith, but to humility, right? To virtue itself, right? And faith is a virtue, right? But humility is maybe the key one here, right? In that same way, right? I'm sorry, I got a little up my own sentence. But by the same token, right? He's saying that that humanity will sort of continue in this new form, right? I lost the original thread there. I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. You probably had a great idea. If it comes to you, let me know. You were talking about
once a video reliably.
The opposite of Tolkien and kind of romancing the future and that sort of thing.
Oh yeah, he's sort of staking his claim, right? That he is a writer who wants to be on the side of like reason, yes, but subordinate to virtue, right? This is going to be a future that has room for humility, right, and for faith, and all of these things. Is going to be a human future, right? The next world will be a better one, right? As opposed to the sort of like maybe a more fatalistic approach, right? Like maybe it'll happen again, right? Because the universes are getting, I think, better, right, as the cycle goes on, and that's not without pain, right? And that's what separates him from like the kind of Christian art that like even I hate reading, right? Like it's not chintzy, it's not safe. Right, it's very unsafe. It's very heavy and complicated because the truth is heavy and complicated.
Right.
And he doesn't blink for a second at any of this. Right. What Severian does is hard, and it hurts, and that's because anything worth doing will. Right. And this is the thing that's most worth doing. It's saving humanity. Right. It's making sure that we survive the next universal day, and so that's going to hurt more than anything. But I guess the thing is, did you figure out the Apu Punchao part?
No, not entirely. No, that was fairly mystifying to me, Christopher.
Okay, we'll leave that for Earth then.
Okay, all right.
I just wanted to see if you got it because you can figure it out, but it's really hard. I didn't get it until I read Earth, and I was like, oh, okay, this is awesome. So
I didn't have time. If I had read it a little more slowly and if I had thought about it. And then I was going to like watch a podcast to like try to like think about it. And then I was like, oh, that's going to spoil everything. And with what you just said, man, you're making me want to start reading it over again tomorrow. What you just said about the future, that was so inspiring. And I hope that's what this book means. And I hope that's what Wolfe was doing. It's still all kind of too fresh in my head, but that's a really beautiful vision for the future. And makes me really want to like dig in again. I'm positive I will reread these, and now I'm thinking probably multiple times.
Yeah, I've added them to my list. I usually reread Tolkien once a year. I don't know if this one will be quite once a year because doing both of those in the same year is arduous. Maybe I'll watch it. Who knows? But they are my Tolkien and Wolfe are my two favorite writers. As I think people know.
Of course. I'm actually going to stop us there because that was so eloquent and it was such a lovely way to end it. And I will just say that if you guys haven't picked these up yet, you definitely have to. Try not to be too overwhelmed. What I really loved about this second volume, you've got witches respiriting the dead, you've got necromancers, you've got vivimancers, you've got wizard battles in this one.
We didn't even talk about the wizard battle.
We didn't talk about
that bit's so good.
Go ahead.
Oh no, we don't have to go into it, but I can't believe like this is how much stuff is in these books for as not long as they are. There's a whole thing with wizards who might be really telepaths. We don't know. They're definitely, doing just regular magic tricks sometimes, but like, who knows? And we didn't talk about Hedor or Agia. We didn't
talk about Hedor and those salamander blooming fiery snake monster things. And we didn't talk about the, giant, like, what were those tower things? Those giant like metallic.
The flying saucers during the like actual battle, and the Valkyries that are flying around with ray guns. No,
the Valkyries, man, that is so cool.
like I could talk literally just about the war sequence for as long as we went on about all this stuff, because there was so much in that like I totally missed until this last read through, and just how like weird and cool the entire like dynamic of the actual fighting is, and how Vodalus gets tied in, and the death of the Autarch, and like the forced march and all of this stuff.
Because we talked a lot about these deep philosophical issues, but we could have talked at length about some of the really like just badass sci-fi trappings that this book has. Time traveling aliens, floating islands. There's just
it would probably be better if we did that, right? Because the people who, God bless them, have made it this far are like these two freaking nerds. All right. Like, is this book hard to read? I don't know. Like, what's going on?
I just have to enter a different mode. Like, you have to say, okay, Jordan, let's talk about the really cool sci-fi stuff. And then we'll get all into like the guy with the weird head on the side of his sticking out.
Yeah, Typhon and his head transplant.
And how he just comes
Typhon is so important. He's like, he's literally Satan, right?
Yeah,
because like they go through the bit where he tempts Severian with food and power and like all, exactly the
He reminds me of Karn Sagara a little bit.
That is
a
interesting.
little bit.
Oh, no, that's interesting.
Just one aspect of, or how about that tower that the map that he's given, and this special map that allows him to basically do interdimensional travel.
The last house. Yeah, the time machine where the tower like he's landed this rocket on the Earth in the future, and like the lower levels of it reach back in time.
And then as you go up, you're like going back in time or something.
Going forward as
you're going forward in time to the Earth's death. So it's getting colder and colder.
Yeah, and so he's from a different future, right? Because there are parallel futures in play as well. Because there's the plant guy who's from the future where the new sun comes, because the sun is bright enough for Plant Man to live, right?
Right.
And this guy's from a future where the last like humans get off Earth.
Master Ash.
Master Ash, and he's descended from the people who escaped from Cthulhu and the last ice, right? And managed to go on and survive with the help of the Hydra Jewels in the future that like God's not coming, right? Basically, right? Like we lost, right? Because of course every sort of quantum future is accounted for somewhere, right? And God, no, like
well, wait, Christopher. So the fact that he at the top of his tower, he can see like the dying of the sun, the fact that he's up there and can see it, can observe it, does the fact that Severian removes him according to his instructions, does that fact help to bring about the birth of the new sun?
I don't know if it does that exactly. What I think it just does is it helps to really concretize the influx nature of the future, because the further away he gets from his ship, right, the less and less he exists.
Yeah.
Right. So his existence in our time is really predicated on whatever mechanism in his ship tower, right, is keeping him rooted in our past, because he's kind of an archaeologist, right? He's trying to get a look at Earth before it went bad, because we're trying to figure out what went wrong, basically, right? And so he's sort of digging through layers of time, like any archaeologist, right? And so no, I don't think that Severian's actions necessarily preclude his future. I think they just they illustrate a weird way for that particular man's story to end, and that helps give you a bit of a map of time. Now there might be more to it that I don't know, because like you've positioned me as like the wolf expert in this, and while I like know more than the average bear, perhaps, like I by no means am Mark Aramini or like Michael Andrew-Driussi or the guys even Alizbo Soup, right? Like I have not spent as much time and effort poring over every single thing. I am just a very enthusiastic fan. And so there is still stuff that I don't get, right? If you ask me what an arctother is, I don't remember right now, right? Just that it is a word that I heard several times. So I could be wrong, and there could be stuff I'm not getting, but yeah, I do want to reiterate here at the end, because I know we said we were going to wrap it up, and then we talked about all the stuff, but like for all the philosophizing that Jordan and I have done, that's just because that's Jordan and my thing. Right?
I know.
That's what we were going to talk about, guys. And you knew that when you got here.
I know.
And if you didn't know that, I'm sorry.
The tangents were out of control today. I'm
but
sorry about that.
but I do hope everybody like enjoyed it, right? And I really hope that this has not scared you from reading Gene Wolfe, right? You know, I think it was Le Guin called him science fiction's Melville, but like if you don't like Melville, that's not a reason to not read Wolfe, because Wolfe is way more fun than Melville. Not that Melville's not, you know, fun, but like this is, I'm a science fiction guy. This is awesome, right?
Yeah.
Now, like, and just have faith that you're smart enough to read it, because Gene Wolfe does, right? He's
Yeah.
not treating you like a fool. He believes in you, all right? And
Yeah.
you know, I
And
believe in you too.
this is not so bad. I mean, it's dense for sure. It's dense. It's literature. So you have to go in kind of like you're reading almost James Joyce or something like that. But millions of people have read James Joyce. I'm not saying it's exactly at that level, but all I'm saying is that you can get through one of these if you want to really absorb the ideas. You can get through one of these in 2 weeks. If you want to kind of breeze through it just for your first read through, you could probably do each one in a week if you're really kind of disciplined and you're like, you know, reading into the evening and things like that. But I was pleasantly surprised, because I feel like a lot of people were trying to keep me away from this series by saying it is super ultra dense. You're not going to know what the hell is going on. It's like, no, like I'm going to know a lot more next time, but I feel like I did pretty well this first time, and I really enjoyed it.
And people doing that, like, you know, they're just wrong, right? Like this is my favorite science fiction series, right? Everybody knows how much I like Dune. I don't like Dune half as much as I like this. It's so awesome. And I really hope you all will check it out. And I guess we'll be back to talk about Earth, which is actually my favorite one of the 5.
Okay. I'm so excited. All right. We'll do Earth in September, Christopher, if you're able. And I hope you guys tune in for that. Subscribe, guys. Catch up with me on Goodreads, on Facebook, and maybe, you know, flip a coin to your starving booktuber on Patreon. So until next time, happy reading. Thanks for joining me, Christopher. Bye, everyone.
Bye, guys.